All right, guys, thanks for joining me. Remember, I'm still there in the Google Meet, that if any of you have any questions as we're going through this lecture or anything like that, you can pop back over and ask me. And again, there's going to be a few points to kind of check in on, so make sure you're doing that. As you can see, I've moved the board that I use sometimes the last few days have had behind me that says SOHCAHTOA. We are still dealing with right triangles, but SOHCAHTOA is not important today, and my first few papers slides will kind of tell you why. So today's lesson is called Pythagorean's Theorem. And again, if you're at home and kind of watching this and, you know, mom or dad or an older brother or sister, sibling, something like that is maybe around, they're going to be like, you know, Pythagorean's Theorem, that's like the one thing I remember from high school math or whatever. So it's something that kind of sticks with people's minds just because a little bit of the name of it. So the reason it's called Pythagorean's Theorem is because a guy named, well, his name was Pythagoras, but he is the one who came up with this idea with a triangle. It does have to be a right triangle, okay? And there's a few things I want you to know, but this will tell us the length. So you know how a couple days ago we were solving for length? But when we were solving for length the other day, we had an angle. Pythagorean's theorem will tell us an unknown length, but we don't even have to know an angle. We just have to have the other two sides. Okay, we just have to have the other two sides. So if we know two sides of a right triangle, it has to be a right triangle. If we know two sides of a right triangle, we can find the third side using this theorem. All right? So a couple of things, and like if somebody's in the background and saying, oh, I think I remember what Pythagorean's theorem is, they're probably going to remember it correctly, but we have to be a little bit careful. Number one, we're dealing with a right triangle, okay? That means we have sort of like our opposite leg, our adjacent leg, and our hypotenuse, okay? For Pythagorean's theorem, the only one that matters, there's only one that really matters, is the hypotenuse. Okay, and so I'm going to show Pythagorean's theorem most of the time. Like if you would Google search it right now, you could probably Google search it on your phone, and this is the equation that they would give you. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, where a and b represent two legs of the triangle. But this is the part, and this is where I like to write it a second way, not because a squared plus b squared equals c squared is wrong. Here's the thing that we have to be careful about. C squared has to be the longest side of our right triangle. And since we have a right triangle, the longest side is going to be the hypotenuse. So you know how the last few days I've been encouraging you to look at a triangle and put the words of our opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse on the triangle? I'm actually still going to do that, but this is the important thing. Today, the opposite leg and the adjacent leg don't make a difference, and it doesn't even matter which one you write first. But this is the most important thing. The hypotenuse is the one that is on this side by itself. We take our two legs on the one side, opposite, adjacent, if you would want to label them that way, but the hypotenuse has to be on the side by itself. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared is okay, but you're not always going to know a and b. You've got to look at your triangle and know, hey, do I know my two legs and therefore should I put them together and solve for the other side? Do I know my hypotenuse? And so as I look through these few examples here, you've got to be careful about what side is the hypotenuse only. And therefore, I'm going to encourage you, if you draw these out in your homework or if you're looking on the computer screen, you still know which one is the hypotenuse. So you might want to pause to draw this triangle. But the most important leg is the hypotenuse. So we're going to go to the right angle and go across from the right angle. And this first example, I did happen to make the hypotenuse Rx. The hypotenuse will not always be x, and that's why you have to be very careful when you're working on these problems and looking through these problems. So this time the hypotenuse is my unknown. My other two are numbers. And so I am going to write down a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but I have to remember that c has to be the hypotenuse, okay? So what is one of your legs? It does not matter which one we write down first, just so you know. So one of our legs is 5.6. So I'm going to write 5.6, and I'm going to square it. I didn't square it yet, but I know I have to. I'm going to write 6.3, and I'm going to square it. And then since that one is my unknown, I'm going to write x squared. Now, please don't think because everything has a squared, I can just ignore it. That is actually completely wrong. Remember, order of operations says powers are more important than addition or anything else. So the very first thing I would like you to do with me, please, on your calculator, since we have 5.6 and I'm supposed to square it, I'm going to type 5.6 on my calculator and I got 31.36. Please do not round anything until it is our final answer. I am also going to type 6.3 in my calculator and square it. And I get 39.69. And since I don't know what x squared is yet, I am going to leave that side as x squared. All right? So right now, I did order of operations and I squared those numbers first. X is on this side, so I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to add these two numbers together. So I'm just going to type in my calculator 31.36 plus 39.69. And I get 71.05. Okay? If you don't do it in this order, you will not get this answer. Okay? So at this point, if you're not understanding how I got that answer and how I had to square the 5.6 first, I had to square the 6.3 first, and then I added, this is the order you're going to have to pretty much do all of your homework in. There's a couple in a minute that I'm going to do it maybe in a slightly different order. But I still don't have x by itself yet. This is the weird one. We don't divide by 2. When we have an x squared, we use that weird thing that's called the square root. Okay, we use that weird thing that's called the square root on both sides. You can see a square root button on your calculator. It's kind of on the left side of your calculator if you're using one of those TI-30s. If you're using your phone to use Desmos, you can see it across the bottom, right there on the bottom. Everybody see how right next to your 0, there's that ABC button right there. That would give us the square root. So please type in your calculator, whichever one you happen to be using, the square root of 71.05. And this is the last step. So on this step, I will round. X is going to approximately equal 8. Okay, I'm going to read my whole calculator. It says 8.42911620515. That's what my entire calculator says, but we're going to round to the tenths place. So the tenths place would be 8.4 because following the 4 is a 2, and so that would keep it at 8.4. All right, so there we go. All right, the next one I'm still going to work with you all the way through, pretty much all the way through. So here is the picture. Go ahead and copy down the picture. Please figure out what leg is your hypotenuse leg. I'm going to write it. X is once again our hypotenuse leg. So if you need to hit pause because maybe I go a little bit faster, a little bit slower than you, would you please hit pause and figure out what Pythagorean's theorem should be? You don't have to solve it completely. But if you haven't written it down yet, I would encourage you to pause again because I'm about to put up the paper with the answer, not the complete answer, but the first answer of what your first equation should look like. Remember, x was our hypotenuse, so it has to be on that side by itself. So if this is what I'm getting, I am going to square each of those numbers individually. So 4.4 squared is 19.36. 4.8 squared is 23.04. Got to square each of those numbers first, and now math says to add them. So 19.36 plus 23.04 is 42.4. So x squared equals 42.4. X squared, that means I got to take the square root of both sides. And so on my calculator, I'm going to type in the square root of 42.4. And the whole thing says oh, I forgot. I was going to have you guys check back in with me. I kind of already started to say it. But would you please hit pause right now and come back to the Google Meet and say, hey, Miss Jabs, you started to give the answer away, but the full rounded answer would be. And so this is technically example 2, but it's checkpoint number 1. Please come back and check in with me for checkpoint number 1. All right, I told you to come back to the video because there is more. You can see there was a little bit more on there. I got to tell you, you have to be careful with Pythagorean's theorem. Remember, I said I kind of don't like a squared plus b squared equals c squared because when you have that, people don't always realize that c squared is supposed to be the hypotenuse. And so sometimes they get their equation mixed up a little bit. Well, would you please look at this next example? Again, if you needed to hit pause, rewind just a few seconds and hit pause. It is very important for us to know what the hypotenuse is. And if we look at this triangle and I go across from the right angle, the hypotenuse already has a number on it. So this example, I can't do like I did the other examples. This is why you always have to be careful when you're looking at your homework. You should not assume. How many times have I said in this class, don't assume things? You should not just assume you're going to write down this number and square it, this number and square it, and then take the square root. Plus, if you look at this triangle, wouldn't you like to tell me that x is the shortest leg? Okay? Remember, the hypotenuse is always supposed to be the longest leg. The number you told me when you checked in is bigger than either of these numbers. On our first example, the number that we found as our answer was bigger than either of these two numbers because the hypotenuse has to be the longest leg. So that means our biggest number in this answer, biggest number has to be 19.7. Our x cannot be bigger than 19.7. And actually, we should look at this and actually think that our x is going to be smaller. And so x has to be on a side, not with the hypotenuse. So remember, I said the hypotenuse has to be on the side by itself. What are my two legs? Good. 15.6. So I've got to square that. My other leg is x. So I've got to square that. And my hypotenuse is 19.7, and I have to square that. But please notice this time x is on this side. It's okay if I would have had that 15.6 and that x switched, but x is now on this side. I have to be careful about how I do math. I am still going to square my numbers first. So I'm going to use my calculator to do 15.6 squared. That gives me 243.36. X squared was my next thing, and there is no value for x squared, so I'm going to leave that as x squared. The next thing I need to do is 19.7 and square it. That tells me 388.09. 388.09. So hopefully you typed each of those into your calculator with me and squared each one, and that's what you got. Please notice, x this time is not on a side by itself. So how would I get rid of this 243 number? I don't want it on this side with x. I want to move it to the other side. So I am going to subtract that 243.36. Now I got to tell you something. You need to be careful with the order that you type this in. You cannot find the square root of a negative number. So if you do this backwards on your calculator, the value that you get will be the right value, but you will see a negative answer instead of a positive answer. And so my answer is 144.73. When I took 388.09 minus 243.36, I got 144.73. It should be positive. If you did not get a positive 144, it's because you did those in the opposite order. If you did not get 144, you might need some help and pop over and say, Miss Jeds, I don't know how I'm supposed to get 144. Please notice, is x squared by itself yet? And so to get x squared by itself, I have to take the square root of both sides. And so if I take the square root of 144.73 and I round it to a whole number, it would be 12, not a whole number to the decimal place. I see 12.0303762 It keeps on going. So since I'm rounding, it's kind of weird. I should still put the X with the squiggly. My squigglies started out as straight lines and then I switched them up. So it should be a squiggly equals. Since I'm rounding, I still have to put that 0.0, even though most of the time with 12, we won't put 0. But since we're rounding, we want to put that 0.0. And notice, X is 12. It was the shortest leg and it is the smallest number. You got to be careful. So I am going to do one more. I'm going to help you get it set up, but I'm even going to stop even shorter. This is the last example. Okay. The other day, some of you guys checked in with me and like, oh, are we supposed to work through it with you or just tell you the answer? Actually, it's okay if you just start to write down this answer, start to write down this example. I'm going to get it started with you. So if you want to try it completely by yourself, that's fine. But if you want to hit pause so you get it copied down, I am going to make sure you have it set up correctly first. But then I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to say, go to the Google Meet and tell Miss Jabs the answer. If you're still not sure what to do, I'll work through it with you. If you are sure what to do, just tell me the answer and then you should be good for your homework. So here is the example problem. Oh yeah, and sometimes people told me they had trouble. So here's the deal. I know I have this piece of paper. It looks a lot better to me sometimes if I make the right angle be on the bottom or maybe like the top like that, because then it's a lot easier. You can turn your Chromebook and stuff like that so things look a little bit better. But if I do this and I put my pencil here and I go across, 7.4 is the hypotenuse. And so I would need to set this up in the order one way or the other. It doesn't matter. With this 4.2 and the X on the same side. I happen to write my 4.2 first, but you could put your X first. Please remember all of these have to have squares. Please remember to be careful as you plug it in your calculator and do the math. But your second checkpoint is to come back to me and say, okay, Miss Jabs, I solved that last triangle and my answer for X is... And then you should be able to work on the homework. The homework will look just like those problems. I hope you have a good day and I'll see you on the Google Meet and good luck on the homework.